Good day. Today is Saturday, 8th February 2025, and the Ukrainian conflict continues and grinds on, as does the political revolution that the Trump administration is trying to execute in the United States. Now, there's been some very interesting developments there, perhaps not quite as epically enormous in their implications as some of the others that we have seen, but nonetheless they are interesting and they do point in a certain direction. Firstly, President Trump has taken the step of revoking the security clearances of former President Biden, denying former President Biden, access to classified information or briefings by the US intelligence community. Now, I have to say, this was something that former President Biden, when he was President Biden, did to Donald Trump after Donald Trump lost the presidency in 2021. So you could say that this was a tit-for-tat action, and I'm sure that there is an element of that. But of course, it must also be seen in the wider context of the continued huge shakeout that continues to take place across the United States government as more and more people are suspended, taken out of, or indeed fired. USAID, as I understand it's more normally referred to, it has been downsized. I believe its staff has been reduced from something like 10,000 people to just 200 people. In other words, it's functioning now as a skeleton agency. And my own view about USAID is that at some point, when the moment appears to be right, I think that the administration, Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, Elon Musk, and all of the others, I think that they've already made a decision to close it down. Now, I've had some discussions with a number of people about this. I've not spoken, however, to the one man who I would give the greatest weight of authority to on these questions, who I personally know, and that is, of course, Robert Barnes. But anyway, based on my own understanding of the law, based on the of the various legislation that was passed back in 1961 in President Kennedy's day, based on what I understand presidential prerogatives are, I believe that the president does have the power to close USAID down by executive order. And I think that as the arguments about this work their way through and the legal position becomes clarified, I suspect that that is what is going to happen. Of course, right across the world, including in the United States, various supporters and beneficiaries of USAID are still coming forward, writing pieces, telling us what a terrible thing it is that this organization is being closed down. There's been a long article about this, for example, in the British media, in The Guardian, by the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, lamenting the closure of USAID. I'm going to say again, my own straightforward view about this. No doubt USAID did do good things, but it's also clear to me that it became involved in all kinds of other activities which were far removed from its original remit, the one that was intended when it was set up by President Kennedy all the way back in September 1961. And even if the allocation of funding still tended to weigh towards the more, shall we say, conventional and beneficial things that USAID did. I think the energy and focus of the people who were running USAID basically was focused instead on all the covert, all the covert operations, the funding of news media, which some people astonishingly are defending, the various other actions like those that supposedly happened recently in Bangladesh. That was the main interest and purpose of the organization. All the other things it was doing, the good things, if you like, were happening in a more, shall we say, automatic way. It was things that were, if you like, already part of the machine. The manual side of its work, the thing that required the more energy and intellectual focus and the attention, were the covert operations. And I think those covert operations did not in the end work to the benefit of the United States. All sorts of governments that the United States disliked have been overthrown, and all of that has indeed happened to quite a considerable extent over the last 50 years. But if you look at the totality of these activities, of the regime change operations that have been launched around the world, and I want to make it clear, I don't consider USAID to have been the only agency involved in them, but it was certainly an important part of the architecture. If you look at, the funding of media agencies and the funding of schools and the education and perhaps indoctrination, as some would say, of people around the world, and you also look at the relative position of the United States in the world, even as all of these things have been going on, I think you would be very hard-pressed to say that all of this has worked in the end to the United States' benefit. Even as all of these covert activities were stepped up in all sorts of places, even as governments like the one in Georgia, for example, have faced immense pressure and have become, shall we say, less sympathetic to the United States than they would have been. Overall, American power and American prestige and America's relations with many countries around the world, including arguably the most important ones, has declined. The United States, to say it straightforwardly, is a less powerful, a less influential, a less happy and self-confident society than it was 30 years ago, when all of these regime change activities and all of the rest really took off. So I think closing it down, perhaps looking at the good things it did, and perhaps setting up another agency which can do these things, but which will do them in a much more open and transparent way, providing regular reports to Congress. Apparently USAID was consistently resisting efforts by people in Congress to get them to disclose information. Anyway, having a much more open and transparent agency, one which did not get into bed with shady billionaires with particular ideological positions and business interests around the world. And I'm thinking of one particular person who seems to have played an outside role, but because I have to be careful, I don't intend to name him. Anyway, though I think most of you can guess who I mean. Anyway, all of this can be done, and it can be done much more straightforwardly and much more effectively, which does not infuriate, anger, and alarm world governments and cause all the trouble that the United States has experienced, and which the world has experienced as a result of all of the actions which have been taken. I think many people, again, when they look at all of these events, are simply oblivious or won't recognize how bad and sinister in so many ways things have become. I will just give an example. Some years ago, on one of my programs on this channel, I mentioned complaints, a public report, in fact, that the Russian intelligence agency had published, in which they said that US embassies around the world were in the habit of giving instructions to various governments as to how they would vote in votes in the UN General Assembly. And I was careful to say that these were allegations only by the Russian intelligence agencies. I said I didn't myself know whether that was really what was happening, though I found it astonishing that the United States would apparently lobby and coerce governments in the way that the Russians were saying, threatening, for example, to deny student visas to diplomats of the countries that were being present so that they would not be able to study in US universities, and bringing all kinds of other forms of pressure. So I was very, very careful to make it clear that these were only allegations, and I just seen this report and I wasn't sure myself. Didn't have direct knowledge that this was going on. And then I was absolutely astonished to receive a huge deluge of emails and correspondence and contacts from people right around the world. Latin America, I remember, was particularly heavily represented, but there were a lot of people from Africa and some from East Asia as well. Some of them were journalists in these countries, others were government officials, there were some diplomats, and I seem to remember, I can say for a fact, that there were even some former ministers. And they told me that not only was the Russian report absolutely true, but they gave examples of some of the direct coercion, if you like, that they themselves, the people who were writing to me, had been personally familiar with. So this is the world that we have been living under for some time, one in which instead of diplomacy and persuasion, and yes, we live in the real world, sometimes governments do take firmer positions and do use some of the coercive tools that they have. Instead of that, we had a situation where the US State Department was basically telling governments around the world how they should vote, sometimes weeks and months in advance, at the General Assembly, expecting them to vote along American lines on every issue, even on minor and uncontroversial issues, and bringing out all of the coercive apparatus, all the threats and pressure and all that kind of thing, which, well, the Russian intelligence people were talking about, and which all of these people who contacted me confirmed to me. So the point is that none of this ultimately works to the advantage of the United States. I still remember, this is years ago, a fairly early stage in the existence of this channel, I remember the anger that was communicated to me about these practices by some of the people, by many of the people who were writing to me. America might have gained support from some governments in particular votes in the General Assembly, but the overall loss of goodwill must have been enormous and hardly made the whole practice, worth that sort of cost. So, again, to repeat, I think that this is a good thing that we are seeing, and of course it's now expanding to other things. There's been attempts to rein in the intelligence community. People are being offered the option of retirement, taking out early retirement. I'm going to guess that quite a few people will. Apparently, all of the people who were involved in transfers of money and weapons to Ukraine are now suspended. This is what I've read. Of course, I can't prove that this is so, but apparently there have been several comments to this effect, and that there's a big audit and investigation underway. All of those intelligence community people who were involved in the various scandals of the last couple of years, and the scandals, of course, specifically that we saw play out during the first Trump and then the Biden administration. Many of them have been suspended. They've had their security clearance withdrawn. And again, I can't myself say that I think this is wrong, given the kind of activities that these people were engaged in. I mean, including spreading, publishing a absurd message on the eve of the 2020 election about the laptop of the president's son, the future president's son, Joe Biden's son. I mean, all of this should have consequences, in my opinion. And I'm glad to see that it does. And people who have been using their power in that kind of way, I think it is an entirely good thing that they're having that power, for the moment at least, taken from them. Anyway, there have been a few more developments. It seems that the new Attorney General, Mrs. Bondi, has now closed down an organisation within the Justice Department, whose job it was to go searching out and looking for people, mostly, it seems, Russian oligarchs, in order to freeze their assets and to prevent these people gaining access to their money. I've been aware of the activities of this organisation, of this department, within the Justice Department for some time. Again, I think this is an entirely correct thing. If these people who are being targeted in that way have committed actual crimes against US law and over which the United States has proper jurisdiction, then of course the Justice Department has every right to go after them. But if it is otherwise, and in this case, of course, it was otherwise, then this is a blatant violation of due process and of rights of private property. Again, the way it was being conducted was not achieving anything of value to the United States. It simply meant that some very rich, very powerful people in Russia, and I suspect in other places, who might once upon a time have been naturally predisposed to be friendly to the United States. I say this regardless of their morals and business ethics and all of that kind of thing. Anyway, these people, many of them no doubt deeply unpleasant people, but as I said, we're talking about due process and justice here, proper administration of justice here. Anyway, these people who have legal rights, as we all do, all that will have happened is that they will have been infuriated and alienated and will have become more inclined to be anti-American. So again, I think this is entirely the right thing. Close this entity down. I don't know what's going to happen to the people who were involved in it. And apparently the funding that's gone to support this agency is being redirected to combat the cartels. And I can't say that that is wrong. I'm very skeptical that much will be achieved in combating the cartels. After all, so much has been tried and has never really worked, but I'm not going to go into that discussion now. At least targeting the cartels does target what are actual criminal organizations which are recognized as such, and that is a legitimate part of law enforcement. So anyway, lots of these sort of things are taking place. And I suppose, in fact, I have absolutely no doubt that it is what is going on in Washington that is the most important. And we will see, no doubt, over the next couple of weeks and months. And again, I suspect that the legal processes need to be shaped. The mood in the country, in the United States, needs to be evolved as well. But I have no doubt that in time, we're going to see more targeted sanctions. Sanctions that are going to start affecting countries in Europe, the European Union as a whole. And that process is going to continue to evolve. But in the meantime, as all of this plays out, the major conflict, the big conflict in the world, the one in Ukraine, the one which the Russians are unequivocally winning, and I want to repeat that, that continues. Now, President Trump has been saying more things about it. He's been repeating again that the war needs to be brought to an end. He's coming up with new, and I'm going to say fantastic figures for the numbers of people that he believes have died on each side in the war. I'm going to say straightforwardly that I believe that his figures for the Russians are completely off. I think they're completely wrong. And I wonder where he's getting them from, or whether he's just coming up with figures off the top of his head. Just saying. But anyway, President Trump has been talking about that. He's again been talking about putting future aid for Ukraine on a transactional basis, getting the Ukrainians to provide the United States with their mineral wealth in return for whatever future help that the United States gives them. As I said previously, I think this is a trap for Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have access to much of this mineral wealth. What is still to be found on Ukrainian-controlled territory obviously cannot be accessed until the war itself ends. And in many cases, given the difficulties of extraction and processing, it would take years, perhaps even decades, before this mineral wealth could be used to repay the United States in the way that has been suggested. And I think Donald Trump understands that very well. So this whole discussion, this floating of this particular topic, I think by putting it on a transactional basis brings us closer to the day when Trump and his people will say that the Ukrainians can't pay, that this is a losing proposition for the United States, and that the time, therefore, has come to walk away. Anyway, President Trump has said that he does expect, however, to meet Zelensky soon, perhaps next week. He's floated the possibility that Zelensky might come to Kiev, to Washington. Clearly, Donald Trump has no plan at the moment to go to Kiev. Obviously, Trump and Zelensky have met in the past. I've never got the sense that Donald Trump thinks very much of Zelensky, just saying. I mean, I remember when Zelensky was in Washington in September and they had their meeting, Trump and Zelensky, in Trump Tower in New York. I remember the body language of the two men. Trump came out of the meeting looking exuberant and confident, and Zelensky looked, I thought, downcast and somewhat crushed by the encounter. So I don't expect this particular meeting to go especially well at a personal level, though no doubt the usual bromides and cliches will be circulated about how wonderfully well the meeting went and how the two men developed similar views on many things and how things can be taken forward. All of this, of course, in advance of Kellogg's trip to the Munich Security Conference, where we're told he's going to unveil his plan. Now, I've seen a number of comments on threads to my previous videos, comments which I should say originate with one person, and this person makes the absolutely correct observation that it is extremely strange. It is, in fact, frankly bizarre that a plan to end a conflict of this kind should be unveiled before there's been any serious discussion with one of the main parties to the conflict, which is, of course, Russia. Now, I have myself been involved in negotiations to end conflicts. I've acted as a mediator in the past. These have obviously been legal disputes. But I have to say from my own background and experience that I absolutely endorse that. If you really are seeking to bring two parties to a conflict together and to get them to talk and to persuade them to negotiate and move forward in negotiations, the absolute last thing you do is set out a plan of your own and try to impose it on one or the other or both of them. What you actually do is you go and meet each party separately. You then contact the other party. You say, this is the thinking of the other side. What are your ideas? You get a kind of dialogue underway that way. You gradually find what the points of potential agreement are, and then you build on them. You certainly don't, as I said, go proposing plans which either side, one side or the other, or in the case of Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, most probably both are going to reject. Now, I say that going back to that Daily Mail piece, which republished the Strana peace plan. I call it the Strana peace plan. I've discussed it in many places, and I'm not going to waste more time analysing it. Anyway, the Daily Mail article has at least had the advantage of bringing global attention, if you like to put it that way, to the Strana plan. And obviously, the Russians have made clear that the Strana plan, from their point of view, is fundamentally flawed and that the Russians won't accept it. But I've seen comments about it from Ukrainians and Ukrainian supporters, people like Julian Röpke, the German correspondent for Bild Zeitung, and they are shocked by this plan as well. They find that from their point of view, from Ukraine's point of view, this is a bad and unworkable plan. Röpke spoke of it as capitulation to Russia. So if Kellogg is indeed, as I rather suspect, going to accept this plan, well, he faces the prospect that he's going to find it rejected by both sides, which at this stage in a negotiation would be a very bad thing, in my opinion. It would mean that the negotiations, if that is what he really wants to achieve, would not be able to move forward at all. And we are increasingly seeing the incoherence, the illogic in much of what Kellogg is saying. So he's made some, actually, well, I won't say they're exactly correct, but some interesting points about casualties and about the Russian way of war. And he says that it is always a big mistake to allow yourself to be drawn into a war of attrition against Russia. And by the way, about that, I would completely agree. He says that the Russians are accustomed to wars of attrition and know how to fight them. About that, I agree also. And then Kellogg goes on to say that given that the Russians know all about wars of attrition, expecting casualties to change their perspective on wars of attrition is wrong, because they're always prepared to accept enormous casualties. And he cited the example of the Battle of Stalingrad in the Second World War, where the Soviet Union lost hundreds of thousands of men in order to achieve victory, which of course it did. And Kellogg suggested that the Soviets were happy to do that without so much as turning a hair. Now there, I think actually he is wrong. He is engaging in a piece of historical error. The Soviets, the Russians, both during and after the Second World War, were very conscious of the immense price they were paying for defending their country and for defeating the Germans. That they were far from indifferent to this. It was just that they made a decision that the war was so important to them, so existential for them, that they had no option but to pay that price. I don't think it's true. And I think we should never fall into the trap of thinking that Russians, any more than any other country, are indifferent to human suffering, and that they have this cold-blooded approach, which means that they're prepared to pile up bodies in order to achieve victory in any particular situation. It's a common misconception in the West, I should say, one very heavily fostered by German writers after the Second World War, but I think that there is no reality to it. But it is true, as I said, that if the Russians believe that the price is worth paying, they will pay it in a particular war. They did so during the Second World War. And in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, they are prepared to go on paying the price that they are currently paying, which, to be absolutely clear, bears no relation to the price they paid during the Second World War. Soviet losses in the Second World War, in even the most minor battle, almost certainly exceeded total Russian losses throughout the entire period of the whole special military operation. So one should be very careful not to compare the two things. But anyway, having made that point, let's go back to Kellogg. If he really thinks that the Russians are indifferent to losses in that way, then why does he think, why do the Americans, why does his boss, Donald Trump, continue to harp on Russian losses and assume that that is going to make the Russians change their course? The Russians don't care if they lose 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 people. Then telling them that if they continue the war and lose even more people, they will lose even more people, on that logic, is not going to dissuade them from continuing the war. As I said, I happen to think that this is factually wrong. I think that this is a misunderstanding of Russian realities. But, as I said, why harp on Russian losses if you say to yourself that the Russians are indifferent to losses? Why think that Russian losses give you pressure if you cite historical examples and argue from those examples that losses don't create that kind of pressure at all? Now, if we go back to the other issue, and here again we have Kellogg, again harping on about sanctions, saying that the sanctions are only, on a scale of 1 to 10, they're only at about 3. Just saying. If he really believes that, well, I discussed the latest economic numbers that have been coming out of Russia. And again, maybe getting some clear understanding of Russian economic realities might help here. I mean, Russia is a continentally sized country. It is abundant in natural resources. It is self-sufficient in food and energy. It has a substantial industrial base. It has a large science and technology community. And by universal acknowledgement, Russian scientists are highly trained and some of the best scientists in the world. That is not a country that is, by definition, going to be very vulnerable to sanctions. Of course, the record of sanctions over the last 3 years has confirmed that. So why come back and talk about sanctions? Now, I've received a very interesting email from an acquaintance of mine. I'm not going to identify him. I should say that he is someone who has had contact with people in Trump's team. That's all I'm going to say about him. Anyway, this person has written to me and has suggested that Kellogg's approach is the approach of somebody who sees himself as a negotiator, whereas what this situation really calls for is a diplomat, somebody who can act as a mediator, somebody who knows how to get sides talking to each other, not somebody who sits down and tries to conduct a negotiation and get other people to accept his views. And by the way, I completely agree with that. I would just add that based on what I have seen, Kellogg is not even a good negotiator. At least he's not someone who is fully informed, sufficiently fully informed about the realities to be a successful negotiator in this particular situation. But I agree, this is a situation that calls for a diplomat rather than a negotiator. And that suggests that Kellogg is perhaps the wrong person to put forward at this time. Well, this person who wrote to me did make an intriguing suggestion, which is that the former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, might actually be brought onto the team and might take over some of the diplomacy, the actual diplomacy from Kellogg. Now, I think this is actually an intriguing idea. Now, I'm reasonably well informed about Naftali Bennett's background. I know that many people consider him even more of a hardliner on Palestinian and Arab questions, Middle East questions, than the current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I know that he provokes very strong feelings amongst a great many people in Israel and in the Middle East and outside. However, he does have diplomatic skills. He has negotiated with the Russians and the Ukrainians in the past, as he did in March 2022, in the lead up to the initialing of the Istanbul Accords. He is somebody who Putin has met and who Putin is able to work with. And he does seem to have a much more realistic understanding of what it takes to bring this conflict to an end than Kellogg currently does. It's an idea. It's an intriguing idea. Maybe not Naftali Bennett, though I would say that, he's as good as anyone else that I can think of. Maybe there are people within the United States who have the same levels of skills. But certainly, it seems to me that though it's no doubt impossible now or impractical to replace Kellogg, maybe it is indeed time that someone with more experience of diplomacy step in and help Kellogg, or perhaps take over from Kellogg trying to do this job. I know that there is a view in the United States that Kellogg is basically a cutout and that the true negotiator is going to be Donald Trump. But Donald Trump has the job of running the United States to do. He needs a point man who has that level of skill. And I doubt that Kellogg, who, whatever his other qualities, is not a diplomat and does not have experience or training as a diplomat, doesn't seem to me to be the person to do it. Anyway, those are my thoughts. As I said, Naftali Bennett, it's an intriguing idea. Maybe some people in Washington might prick up their ears and think about that. As I said, I can think of other people. I'm not going to name anybody. But whatever, getting some kind of discussion underway could, if you're going to do it well, I think it can be done, but it cannot be done in the way that Kellogg is saying and is trying to do. To repeat again, and I'm just going to say this, I've said this in many places now, the United States does actually have some genuine leverage over the Russians. It has, of course, enormous leverage over the Ukrainians, but it does have some genuine leverage over the Russians. It's just that it is not the leverage that people like Kellogg think it is. The Russians want to end this war with a stable situation in Europe and security for their western borders. This is not me guessing their intentions. The Russians themselves have said this many times, and Putin has also said it on more than one occasion. That does point to a negotiated solution to this conflict being optimal for the Russians, in the sense that outright military victory is likely to cause more long-term tensions in Europe, tensions that could keep US troops in Europe in larger numbers and which could create conflicts between the Russians and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Tensions in Europe which ideally the Russians might want to avoid. And if that is understood and the negotiations are approached in that way, then it seems to me that we are much more likely to move forward to some kind of mutual understanding of how the war could end, one which safeguards the core interests of the United States and of the West, than all of this misconceived talk of pressure and coming up of overcomplicated and unworkable plans, which we are seeing at the moment. Now, another country has stepped in and has expressed its own views about this process. I say another country, that's probably an overstatement, but an important Chinese analyst, Mr. Chen Yu, deputy head of the Eurasian Studies Department at the Chinese Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Anyway, he has discussed these ideas that have been coming out of Washington at the moment, the ideas that seem to be associated with Kellogg. And I suspect that Mr. Chen Yu has also seen the Strana plan. And Mr. Chen spoke to China Central Television, and he said this: formally, the United States has proposed a plan in an attempt to bridge the significant gap between Russia and Ukraine, seeking a point of balance or compromise to promote a peace settlement of the conflict. However, fundamentally, the United States aims to turn it into a long-term, unresolved conflict, to exploit it and seize the strategic initiative over time. Washington may wish to maneuver on the Ukrainian issue for a long-term game with Russia and Europe. And then Mr. Chen went on to express skepticism about the viability of the US plan, citing significant divergences with the goals of both Russia and Ukraine. Now that shows sophisticated understanding of why all of these proposals from Kellogg, if they are from Kellogg, but all these ideas that have been floating around, and of course from Zelensky himself, why none of them are going to work. Because exactly as Mr. Chen is saying, what is being proposed here, at least up to now, is not a long-term resolution of the conflict. It is some kind of pause in the conflict, some kind of freeze of the conflict, perpetuating it indefinitely, turning it into a frozen conflict, one which is going to poison the entire geopolitical atmosphere in Europe. And the Russians have already ruled that out. They will not agree to it, and it won't work. A senior Chinese analyst has seen that. The fact that he's expressing these opinions on China Central Television suggests that this is well understood within the Chinese government. Trump has been talking about enlisting the help of China to force the Russians to come to terms. We see that a Chinese analyst is saying that this is not really the way forward, which makes it most unlikely that the United States will be able to force China, or at least persuade China to force Russia to come to terms in the way that Trump himself seems to hope. So there we are. Now, Trump, even as he is about to meet Zelensky, and I would be very interested to be a fly on the wall in the course of that discussion, once again has floated the possibility of meeting with Putin, and the talk now is that the meeting with Putin will take place in late February or March. We still don't know in where or how, whether it be a virtual meeting or a person-to-person meeting. I would say that I think it is always better to conduct these meetings person-to-person rather than virtually. Just saying. At least these initial meetings. Anyway, we will see what happens. But Trump does seem to understand that he does need to speak to Putin at some point and find out what the Russians think. And, well, I hope that happens. And I hope that when Trump does finally meet Putin, and he's been talking at length about how good his relations with Putin once were, I hope that he will listen to what Putin is telling him. Anyway, we shall see where all this goes. In the meantime, the war continues and Ukraine continues to lose. Now, over the last 36, 48 hours, despite the big news in the war, which is the fall of Toretsk, which I will come to shortly, there has been a huge amount of discussion and commentary about the fighting in Kursk region, where the Ukrainians have conducted an offensive, or at least have attempted to conduct an offensive. And there's been much discussion as to what happened, whether the Ukrainians have made any progress. There's claims that they captured the village of Cherkasskaya Konyopelka, which was their primary objective in this offensive. It's a village to the southeast of Suja, and whether the Ukrainians might have gained something. And there's also claims that the Ukrainians, even if they might not perhaps have fully captured Cherkasskaya Konopelka, that they might have captured another place, the village. Apparently it's a tiny place, invisible on any map that I have, the tiny village of Fanaseyevka. Well, there have been many claims and denials about this. There's been reports from Russian bloggers and Russian reporting channels, and of course the Ukrainians have been saying their own thing. I prefer to take my account of what's happened in this battle, in this offensive, from Group of Forces North. Now, I say that, obviously, Group of Forces North know the actual situation in Kursk region, that they are familiar with what is really going on there. And as I've discussed in many programs, Group of Forces North has a most unusual Telegram channel, one with its own personality. It's at times somewhat cantankerous and bombastic, but you get the sense of an actual personality behind it, not the usual bland, rather cold and logical and factual statements that the Russian military tends to come up with. Now, beyond that, and I have to say this, I have found that Group of Forces North has been consistently reliable in what they say. Obviously, they're not always correct, and they do give, by definition, a positive spin on what they're doing. But if they say outright that they control a place, in my experience, they almost invariably are telling the truth. Now, this is what Group of Forces North said late yesterday about the state of the fighting in Kursk and about what the Ukrainians achieved in their so-called offensive, or to be more precise, failed to achieve. So this is what Group of Forces North said, and they're saying that this was the situation yesterday at 1100 hours, which is in the morning, but it's perhaps worth pointing out that further reports from Kursk region suggested that there was no further fighting yesterday or significant fighting so far taking place in Kursk region today. So this appears to have been the situation as of the end, if you like, of the Ukrainian offensive, if that's the right word for it. And this is what Group of Forces North said. As we reported earlier, all enemy military equipment was destroyed and the surviving Ukrainian armed forces soldiers dispersed throughout the forests. Operations are currently underway to hunt them down and destroy them. The village of Fanayevska and the village of Ulyanovsk, it's another of the villages in this area, are completely controlled by Russian troops. So, Group of Forces North is categorically denying reports that Fanasayevka came under Ukrainian control. The search for and destruction of the surviving Ukrainian armed forces soldiers is underway in the forest belts between the settlements. Cherkasskaya Konopelka is also under the control of Russian troops. The houses in the west of the village are located at a distance from the main group of buildings and border a forest area that extends to the nearest street in Makhnovka. This is another small village, which is Kutok Street. Several Ukrainian troops dug in there, but they will be destroyed in the near future. So what Group of Forces North is saying is that yes, Ukrainian troops were able to penetrate some buildings, some houses in Cherkasskaya Konopielka, but they were unable to gain a firm foothold and are being driven out. And then Group of Forces North goes on to say a number of bloggers and military analysts decided that they had a better grasp of the situation and began to sow panic. In the morning, reports appeared that the enemy had captured Ulyanovsk. In reality, they did not even enter the settlement, and that Fanasayevka and also Fanasayevka, and there were panicked cries during the evening that Group of Forces North was lying and that the enemy had either captured or surrounded Cherkasskaya Konopielka. Let us explain. If you saw a video on how an enemy soldier dismounted from a burning armored vehicle and ran into a forest belt in the vicinity of a populated area that you were able to identify from your sofa in Moscow, this does not mean that the enemy captured this or that village. All the above settlements are in close proximity to the enemy, and no one will hold parades there, especially for you, or even arrange photo sessions to prove to any particular expert the presence of Russian troops in, say, Fanasayevka. At the same time, the enemy is transferring more and more reserves to Sudzha every day. The probability of repeated provocations remain high, but we are ready to meet the enemy. All enemy soldiers will be destroyed. So that is what Group of Forces North are saying. They are saying briefly that the Ukrainian offensive was a complete failure, that the Ukrainians failed to capture Fanaseyevka, despite claims to the contrary, which have appeared all over the place. They did manage to enter and occupy for some time some buildings at the far western end of Cherkasskaya Konopielka, but they are isolated and they will be cleared out. They've suffered heavy losses, and whilst there is a possibility of a repeat of the offensive, the Russians overall have managed to hold their own. Now, reports yesterday suggested that this Ukrainian attack was carried out by 2 battalions. A large number of armoured vehicles were used, apparently, most of which, or perhaps all of which, were destroyed. But Group of Forces North are saying that the attack miscarried and was unsuccessful. And since 11 o'clock, 1100 hours local time yesterday, all other reports suggest that there's been no heavy fighting in this area at all. In fact, the reports that I have seen suggest that Group of Forces North is carrying out mopping up operations, as they say, to clear Cherkasskaya Konopielka, the far western edge of Cherkasskaya Konopielka, and some forest plantations nearby of the remaining Ukrainian troops. And I think this is probably true. I don't see any reason to doubt these reports. Elsewhere, Group of Forces North say that they are continuing to advance in the Kursk region. They're saying that there is still heavy fighting going on in Sverdlikova, a much more important village, by the way, than any of the 3 villages that the Ukrainians attacked, that there is heavy fighting going on in Sverdlikova, that the Russians are gradually gaining control of Sverdlikova. As I've discussed in many places, if the Russians capture this village, that puts them very close to the main road, the main supply road the Ukrainians use to send troops and supplies from Sumy region in Ukraine to Kursk region and specifically to Sudzha. And the Russians have also been giving some rather interesting assessments of the military equipment that they have been destroying in the Kursk area. This is since the start of Ukraine's Kursk offensive back in August. And they say that they've destroyed in that time 3 Abrams tanks, 48 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and a staggering 317 Striker armoured personnel carriers. If these claims are true, and of course I cannot verify or corroborate them, then it seems to me that a disproportionate share of the armoured vehicles that the United States has been supplying to Ukraine has been destroyed in Kursk region. I wonder how many Strikers are now left after this trail of destruction. Anyway, I'm not going to say more about the fighting in Kursk. I'm not physically there. As I said, I've explained why I think that there is no, why I personally consider this report from Group of Forces North to be reliable. It looks to me that, like all the other recent offensives that the Ukrainians have conducted in Kursk region, this one has been a catastrophic failure. There are reports of large numbers of Ukrainian troops killed and wounded, more armoured vehicles destroyed. The general position of the Ukrainians has been weakened. So that's the situation in Kursk region. Now, even as Kursk, even rather as the group of forces north has been giving us their account of the battle in Kursk region, the Russian Defense Ministry gave a very detailed account of the fighting in Toretsk, and they've given us their own assessment of the way in which the battle for Toretsk played out. And it is interesting. It does give a sense of the battle in Toretsk from the Russian point of view. And I will read it out again. I mean, you can take much of this with some degree of skepticism. This is a Russian account, bear in mind. The Russian Defense Ministry put it like this: as a result of active offensive actions in the Alexandro-Kalinovskoye direction, formations and military units of the center group of forces liberated Dzerzhinsk. This is the city the Ukrainians call Toretsk. Servicemen of the 1st, 9th, 132nd Guards Motorized Rifle Brigades of the 51st Army and veteran volunteer formations distinguished themselves during the liberation of Dzerzhinsk. Dzerzhinsk is the largest settlement of the Toretsk agglomeration. At the beginning of 2022, the total number of residents in the Toretsk agglomeration was more than 73,500. In Dzerzhinsk, it was about 35,000. As many other big cities of Donbass, the Ukrainians turned Dzerzhinsk, Toretsk city in other words, into a powerful fortified area with an advanced network of underground communications. Almost every building was a well-equipped and protected long-term firing position. Slag heaps and mines located in the northern and western part of the city were also used for defense. Controlling this important defense position opens the route for the further liberation by the Russian army of Konstantinovka and the way into the flank of the enemy grouping in Kramatorsk. The enemy reinforced its troops with 8 brigades and other populated areas in the Toretsk agglomeration were reinforced. Altogether, the Ukrainians deployed 50 battalions. It's around 25,000 men, maybe. The total strength of the enemy grouping was more than 40,000 men. Well, there you go. Among them were some of the most motivated and loyal nationalist formations, including the Azov Brigade, as well as foreign mercenaries. Over the past 5 months of fighting for Dzerzhinsk, Russian troops inflicted significant losses on the enemy. Ukrainian losses were over 70% of military personnel. That means dead and wounded, just to make clear. It is over 26,000 servicemen. The average daily loss of Ukrainian troops was about 200 soldiers killed and wounded. Over 240 tanks and other armoured vehicles, as well as more than 340 field artillery guns and mortars, were neutralised. The liberation of these territories in the Toretsk agglomeration have an area of more than 50 square kilometres. In addition, during the liberation of Dzerzhinsk, in other words, the city of Toretsk, 11 settlements of the agglomeration and 139 square kilometres were liberated. The total advance of the Russian troops to the depth of the enemy defences was more than 13 kilometres. At the moment, units of the centre group of forces continue to liberate other settlements of the Toretsk agglomeration. So what the Russians, in effect, are telling us here is that though the central city of Toretsk has indeed been captured by the Russian army, there is still work to do. There are still villages and other positions around Toretsk city which continue to have to continue to be cleared. The fighting here still has some way to go. But once that is over, then a major fortified position, one of Ukraine's strongest fortified positions, has fallen, and the way is open to capture Konstantinovka and, interestingly, to begin outflanking the Ukrainian grouping in Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. In other words, it looks as if the Russians, instead of launching a head-on attack on Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, are going to do the same thing that they've done in Pokrovsk. They will bypass these cities, cut them off from the west, force perhaps a withdrawal by the Ukrainians from these cities, in effect bringing the entire Donbass finally under Russian control and ending once and forever the powerful fortified lines that the Ukrainians created in this region after the fighting in 2014. So the Russians have given us their own assessment of the battle for Toretsk, and they've also given us some clue as to what they intend to do. Clearly, Konstantinovka and Slavyansk, Kramatorsk are in their sights. I never had any doubt about that, but it is unusual for the Russians to give us a sense of what they're preparing. And of course, we've had more reports about more fighting in other places. It seems that there's been further Russian advances in Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians are now acknowledging them. Looks to me that after the fall of Toretsk, the defense of Chasiv Yar is now definitely in its final weeks. And further north, there's more reports that the Russians have significantly expanded their bridgehead west of the Oskol River, and that they're also busy increasing their foothold on the west bank of the Zherebets River, and they're also now clearing villages, the remaining villages south of Terny, which of course they've captured, and there's reports that they're now storming a village on the Zherebets River called Yampolovka, and that they're going to return soon to Troitsk, which they apparently briefly entered but then withdrew from, and that will mean that the entire east bank of the Zherebets River will have fallen completely under Russian control, and that the Russians, with their existing bridgehead across the Zherebets River, will be strongly positioned to recapture the small town of Liman. Well, there we are. So that's the fighting there. Elsewhere, I get the sense that the Ukrainian counterattacks in Pokrovsk have also failed, and there are reports that the Russians have now captured most of the village of Andreevka in the Andreevka fortified area, and that this area of fortified villages is also coming rapidly under Russian control as well. And there was a report in TASS which said that the Russians who have recently captured Velikaya Novosilka are also starting their advance, and that their objectives are the town of Gulyapolye and ultimately Orechov, all of which appears to set the scene for an advance on the city of Zaporozhye, the great city, industrial city of Zaporozhye, located on the east bank of the Dnieper River, or mostly located, I should say, on the east bank of the Dnieper River. So the point is, the Russians are continuing to advance. And in the next couple of weeks and months, that advance is going to accelerate. Zelensky has now announced a plan. Well, he's not going to mobilize 18 to 25-year-olds. He's not going to simply conscript them. He's going to offer them very attractive terms of service to persuade them to join the army and to fill up the gaps in the Ukrainian lines. It seems that even though Zelensky understands, or presumably understands, how catastrophic the situation on the front lines has become, how desperately short of men the Ukrainian army now is, he is still nervous of expanding the conscription base to include 18 to 25-year-olds, because he senses that doing so will provoke intense resistance and opposition from Ukrainian society. Now, in a recent live stream we did with him, Colonel Jacques Beau, formerly of the Swiss military and one of the most erudite writers on Russian military matters, and incidentally, someone who has been consistently right about the evolution of the war in Ukraine. Anyway, Colonel Bull has said that over the last couple of weeks, some kind of resistance movements have begun to spread across Ukraine, some of them in Russian-speaking cities like Odessa and Nikolaev, have about them something of the quality of pro-Russian partisan movements, but that there is even opposition beginning to develop, some of it armed, in Ukrainian towns and villages in central Ukraine, and perhaps even in western Ukraine, opposed increasingly to the policies of the government of Kiev. Now, I've heard about these reports. It's not fully easy to get a sense, at least I find it very difficult to get a sense, of the extent to which this is actually happening. But if Colonel Bull is right, then that probably explains better than anything else Zelensky's hesitation in calling up these young men from 18 to 25. He's come close to doing this, by the way, terrible thing, but he's never fully made the leap to do it, at least not up to now. I doubt that this partisan activity, if I can call it that, resistance activity, is really extensive enough or serious enough to challenge the authority of the control of the central authorities in Kiev. But presumably, Zelensky doesn't want to test the proposition too far. Just saying. Anyway, weakening Ukrainian army, doubts about the wisdom of mobilization, hesitations about this. Zelensky continues to float ideas about nuclear weapons. One of his officials came up today with the crazy proposal, again, that Ukraine develop a dirty bomb. These are appalling ideas, and the Americans hearing them, if they had any understanding, any wisdom, would say to themselves, we can't possibly work with a government that makes these sort of threats. Anyway, this is the reality of the war. The Russians continuing to advance westwards. The whole negotiation process, I have to say, for the moment, looks to me something of a mirage. Now, I have heard some reports, I've seen some reports, that actually Kellogg and Waltz are isolated within the Trump team, that the consensus view that is starting to form is that Ukraine is indeed a losing proposition. I noticed that the latest Rammstein meeting is not going to be chaired by Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary. He's passed off that privilege to John Healey, Britain's Defense Secretary, who seems to be only too keen to endorse this disastrous idea. Just saying. There's been, by the way, another report in the Daily Mail which says that if Britain really were to send peacekeepers to Ukraine, given the dire state of the British armed forces, sending a force of peacekeepers would absorb the entire British army. There would literally be nothing left. And I think that is, by the way, true. And I would go further and I would say that even if the entire British military army were devoted to peacekeeping in Ukraine, that probably still would not be enough to make a convincing force that could be sent to Ukraine really to deter the Russians. Anyway, that's just my view. So, as I said, Healey and Starmer continue to cling to these fantasies that, they can somehow lead on Ukraine. It's an absurd idea. As I said, there are reports that Kellogg and Waltz are isolated in the position that they're taking, and there are also reports that though Ukraine is indeed receiving dribbles of weapons from the United States, the Trump administration has no intention of going to Congress and seeking more appropriations for Ukraine. And Trump himself does not intend to exercise his drawdown authority to authorize more appropriations for Ukraine. He's just not going to interfere with the commitments to Ukraine that Biden made in the last weeks of Biden's presidency. Well, I hope that this is all so, in which case all this talk about negotiations and peace plans is really just smoke and mirrors. It might even be that. But whatever, it's clear to me now that we are in the end game. The military facts on the ground tell us as much. Now, in my next program, I'm going to be looking at a few other things. One of them is the fact that the new Syrian government has now made it perfectly clear that it does indeed want the Russians to keep their bases in Syria. This is how I interpret events there. And of course, there's more things going on in the Middle East, and we have a festering political crisis now starting in Britain, or so it seems to me, over and above the crises we already have in Germany and France, which are exacerbating. So, what is left of the collective West is buckling under the strain. And in the meantime, as I said, the war in Ukraine, which has been the precipitating factor in this whole crisis, does finally seem to be coming to an end. Anyway, that will be for my next program tomorrow. In the meantime, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. This is me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.